Okay, so today we're going to be speaking about surrealism in Latin America, and I will split this into two recordings again. So the first recording will speak about early surrealist writing groups and artists in Latin America. Of course, it's such a wide, vast, expansive area with so many countries, all heterogeneous, all with their own different nuances of surrealism, that it's impossible to capture all of them, but hopefully I'll give you a flavour of some of the surrealist movements that developed in the 20th century in different areas of Latin America. And in the second recording, I'll speak about Leonora Carrington's text, The Hearing Trumpet. So I'll probably speak a little bit about Leonora Carrington in this recording as well, but mostly I'll be covering her in the second recording, her novel, The Hearing Trumpet. So surrealism was in the air in Latin America from about the 1930s to, you could say, the 1970s. I mean, we could have a whole class discussing, did surrealism end? When did surrealism end? Who says when surrealism ended? But I think you could say that certainly from the 30s to the 70s in Latin America, surrealism was a big thing, but in a different way from the surrealism in Europe. It wasn't really surrealism in the Bretonian sense, and we can think about that. But I'd like to start just mentioning that some of the surrealists, as we said last week, were part of the original French group. So we spoke about Wilfrido Lam and how he was in Paris and became involved with the surrealists. They're also in France, and so he was from Cuba, and another Latin American surrealist that is strongly associated with that early group is Roberto Mata, who was also in Paris and became involved with the surrealists. But if we think about surrealism in Latin America in the fullest sense, writers like Octavio Paz had his work published in the Bretonian journals, it was translated for some of the European journals. And Aldo Pellegrini had a surrealist group in Argentina in 1928 that was in Buenos Aires. It didn't have that much of an impact. I think compared to the European journals, it wasn't that successful. Then there was a group of surrealist poets between 1938 and 43 in Chile called, well, their magazine was called Mandragora, and I think the poets might also have taken on that as a sort of group identity. They were led by Braulio Arenas, and there's a really good book about that in the library, which sort of anthologizes Chilean surrealism. If you're interested in poetry and literary surrealism, it's probably the book for you. It doesn't really mention, as far as I can recall, it's a long time since I read it, it doesn't really mention the visual artists. I would say probably my favourite book on Latin American surrealism is Surrealism in Latin American Literature, Searching for Breton's Ghost by Melanie Nicholson. It's really brilliant. It speaks about all different kinds of representations of surrealism in Latin American literature, but it also, I feel, gives a really good grounding to the movement as a whole, including some of the aspects of the canon that we've spoken about, the European canon. I think it gives a good introduction to everything, so it's definitely worth a look if you're like Latin American surrealism. And also there's an edited volume by Don Ades and Rita Eder and Graciela Speranza, Surrealism in Latin America, Vivismo Muerto, which is also interesting, but definitely I would say the Surrealism in Latin American Literature book by Nicholson is very clear, very, very clearly presented. So anyway, back to the groups. Did I say the movements had been anthologized in a book by Stéphane Bacqueux? I don't know if I mentioned the author's name. So he anthologized the book and the movements, and there's a book in the library. So we spoke about how in Europe they had moved away from total automatism. I think we started to speak about them moving away from that in the period of the Spanish Civil War, and also with the rise of Nazism. They were starting to create these surrealist works that had some shape, some control over the form. And in Latin America, there was a preference. I mean, I say Latin America, of course, so many different writers and artists. They would all have had their own preferences. But I think if we're going to make sweeping generalizations, it's fair to say that there was a preference for some control so that the outputs were lucid rather than totally obscure. And some of the core points in the development of Latin American surrealist literature are black humour and metaphors. We do have, again, some of this objective chance that you have in European surrealist literature, but I think we have a different kind of Latin American surrealism that focuses a lot more on the numinous and the magical and mythical. So some Latin Americans travelled to Europe, as I've mentioned. Mata and also Lam are the key examples of that, and they're remembered as part of the surrealist legacy. So if we think about Mata, his work was easily comprehensible. He went to France and became one of the core surrealists, and he sought to convey the human psyche in visual form. And that's, I think, an interesting thing to reflect as we look at his paintings, because they are certainly busy a lot going on. If that is the human psyche, then there's a lot going on there. But also they can be very mechanized. So there's something machine-like that doesn't necessarily make us think about the human psyche. And they were influenced by Freud and the psychoanalytical view of the mind as a three-dimensional space. So if you were thinking about writing an essay on space, different kinds of spaces, this might be an idea. He also created these hybrid shapes, which has been, the term biomorphism has been used, which relates to abstract forms which evoke natural forms. So it's kind of a combination of the organic and cosmic or machine-like the together. He created these inscapes which they present the artist's psyche as an interior landscape. So that's the term that was used, inscapes, which was a series based on the concept of psychological morphologies. So these were considered some examples of absolute automatism by Breton, and hence Mata being one of the core group of surrealists in France. But I think they're not that indicative of the kind of surrealism that was in the air in Latin America. So in the 1940s and 50s, politics found expression in Mata's work, and he's famous for his images of electrical machinery and distressed figures. So no lecture on surrealism would be complete without mentioning Alejo Carpentier, who some of you might be familiar with if you've taken courses in magical realism. He also went to Paris in 1928, and at that time there was a fascination for Cuban voodoo and anything to do with Afro-Caribbean music or rituals, the Santeria, spirituality, stroke religion that I mentioned last week. And he was part of the European avant-garde as well. Now, he participated in cafe culture. He was to write this seminal text after he had gone back to Cuba. He wrote the prologue to The Kingdom of This World, El Reino de este Mundo, and this has become one of the key texts in magical realism, because he wrote that about Lo Real Maravilloso, which is a key concept in magical realism. It was basically the basis for the widespread interest in magical realism, although it had already been mentioned. And he says it was distinct from surrealism in several ways. So he said, I don't know if I have this. Yeah, he said, he said the surrealists do not experience the marvellous, but manufacture it by tricks of prediction, by juxtaposing objects unlikely ever to be found together, that old deceitful story of the fortuitous encounter of the umbrella and the sewing machine on the dissecting table that led to ermine spoons, the snail in a rainy taxi, the lion's head on the pelvis of a widow, the surrealist exhibitions. And he also said the marvellous invoked in disbelief was never anything more than a literary ruse. So I think we get a sense here of where he is starting to shape or to carve a difference, a dichotomy between this European surrealism and the types of surrealism that are emerging in Latin America. They don't have these are not characterized by these prosaic juxtapositions of very ordinary objects that can't be used together. So we looked at the fur teacup last week, and we've also spoken about the lobster telephone. So we've spoken about the way some surrealist objects could be comprised of really ordinary things but made strange by bringing them into new contexts. And he's saying that in Latin America, faith was necessary to truly believe in the marvellous. So he's thinking here of the marvellous in terms of magic and spirituality and strange things actually happening, rather than being artificially placed together. And he claimed that the marvellous was available in Latin America at every turn. So this idea that there was just some kind of magical realm very close to everyday encounters. And he said that Wilfredo Lam had managed to show Latin Americans their own magic. So I would say that his introduction to the Kingdom of This World would be an interesting, or his prologue rather, would be an interesting text to use as a conceptual lens for your essays if you're interested in this divide between the original surrealism as conceived of by Breton and some Latin American surrealism, or even the relationship between surrealism and magical realism. But even in this, I would say it's quite problematic, and I've put on here a quote by Maria Clara Bernal Bermudez, which I think really sums up the problematic nature of Carpentier's introduction of the Lo Real Maravilloso, and his idea that it's present in Latin America in prominent ways, in rituals and sort of shamanic encounters and voodoo, and that it forms part of ordinary reality. And what Bernal Bermudez argued is that he trapped them in this, a whole, well, more than one continent, in this stereotype that is difficult to escape from. And as time went on, other people have tried to show the modernism in Latin America rather than it always being painted with this brush of magical realism. So there was a big boom in Latin American literature in the 1960s and lots of magical realist texts, and that was really exciting, but it shouldn't define the entirety of the nations and other heterogeneous forms. So I think this conception of the magical in the surrealism in Latin America can be problematic, partly because of its links with the notion of the primitive. And so primitivism is a pejorative term, and it relates to the interest in and appropriation of art forms, spiritual practices and mythologies created by indigenous cultures in Africa, the Americas and Oceania. Yeah. And I guess it perpetuated notions of white supremacy in a sense, because it was derogatory and it was based on this unequal relationship between European culture and the indigenous cultures of other continents. And it's something that you might like to explore in your essays. It is problematic to untangle it. The surrealists had decided that the marvellous could be found in the vision of the emotionally disturbed. So we've already spoken about the surrealist interest in the mind of people suffering from mental health problems. Last week we spoke about Dali's paranoid critical method, and we've also spoken about Breton's interest in what was then called shell shock, which we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, and their fascination with the relationship between these mental disorders and the mind. And so they were fascinated by the vision of emotionally disturbed or people with mental health problems. And they were also fascinated with folk art. So I've spoken about Breton going to Cuba and to Haiti to look into voodoo traditions. And lots of surrealists went to other countries to look into their indigenous art and artifacts. And the surrealists were also interested in the art of children and the sort of innocence of children. So this primitivism sort of brings all of these problematic fascinations together, and it's something that we really need to question when we're looking at the work of the surrealists. So European avant-gardists went to other countries to explore their work, but it's questionable whether or not this was on an equal structure, or whether there was some hierarchy there. So Breton had contact with the Negritude movement, and he went to Martinique as well, and although he did say that he was anti-colonial, so they did believe in decolonization, so it could also be viewed that they were trying to decolonize things to a certain extent. But the relationship that they had with, for example, the original indigenous art in Latin America is certainly positioning it as the other, in the same way that we've looked at already the way they positioned women as the other. So their practices were also part of colonizing the other, even though they might have professed to have an anti-colonial state stance. And so Louise Tythacott in Surrealism and the Exotic has said, in their radical critique of the dominant worldview of their time, then the Surrealists deliberately extolled the virtues of peoples whom Western culture had traditionally debased. Yet this uncritical mingling of the primitive, the mad, and the child had dangerous implications, for it was precisely this idea, the idea that non-Western peoples resembled children or the insane and were thereby incapable of self-determination, had ideologically justified colonialism, end of quote. So it's interesting that they were interested in other cultures, but they're also perpetuating dangerous stereotypes. And this idea had ideologically justified colonialism. So, yeah, it's very problematic. So last week we spoke about Wilfredo Lam. He spent some time in France as part of the Surrealism group, and like the other Surrealists, he was interested in alchemy, the study of how things change basic substances such as metals into other substances. And he also considered transformations in substances and their relationship to magic or the idea of magic and astrology. And I spoke about him being affected by the Spanish Civil War and making propaganda posters, and then going back to Cuba, where he develops his own visual syntax, which synthesizes Afro-Cuban aesthetics and Santeria. And I don't know if I mentioned that he used the exquisite corpse method to develop some of his drawings. So we see complex syncretism in his art, but I think the same charge of viewing the Afro-Caribbean cultures as others can't be levied at Wilfredo Lam. It was his own culture and he was trying to champion it for his own people. So we see orishas, so they are deities, in his art, and we see some of the visual syntax of the European avant-garde, but also he was expressing beliefs in a more vernacular style of art that many middle-class Cubans disparaged. So we spoke about the jungle, we spoke about how the animals and human forms merge, we see fruits representing breasts and the integration of the female form with the landscape, which again could be seen as problematic from gender point of view. It might also make an interesting essay, but we also see some transgender figures in his work and the development of hermaphroditic figures, some with one foot. Later he would develop a horsewoman who gets ridden by the Orisha deity. So we spoke last week about how the gap widened in the 1930s between those who believed in politically engaged art and those who wanted art for art's sake. And this was as a result of the Spanish Civil War and of Nazism. And that, of course, would develop into the rise of Nazism, I should say, which would develop into the Second World War. So the fundamental problem would be problematic for the Surrealist movement until well after the Second World War, and some might argue this problem was at the heart of the demise of Surrealism. The Latin American theorist Ferdinand said that Surrealism failed to achieve its political aims in Europe, and that was because it was undermined or neutralised by the revolutionary character of, it undermined the revolutionary character of Dada, because Dada had really tried to break bourgeois art structures, and I think we could also say that Surrealism attempted to do that as well, but by inviting people into these spaces, surrealist shops where anyone could come in. But it has also been said that the surrealists reasserted their activity into bourgeois realm, and this reinforced the distinction between art and life. So the period of the Second World War and its immediate aftermath caused a lot of surrealists to go into exile in Latin America, and also to go and visit Latin America. So we had in 1938 Breton visited Mexico, and he met with Diego Rivera, the muralist Diego Rivera, and with Frida Kahlo and Leon Trotsky, who was in exile from Stalinist Russia. So Mexican art at the time was strongly visible in what's called the Mexican muralist movement, where artists like Diego Rivera were creating art and putting it on walls where anyone could see it, and creating art using indigenous Mexicans to and sort of counter the hierarchy present in Western art. So Surrealists also went into exile during World War II, and they founded an important journal in New York, which was VVV, and was a journal of art and literature edited by Duchamp and Ernst. And there were quite a few Latin American contributors to it. The Chilean poets Braulio Arenas, Jorge Cáceres, and the Enrique Gomez Correa, as well as Wilfredo Lam and Roberto Mata, who we've spoken to. And also Leonora Carrington's story Down Below, which spoke about her experience in a mental institution in Spain as she was fleeing from the Nazis, was also published in it in 1944. So she would then go on to Mexico and end up staying in Mexico and making it her home. So Kahlo's work is extremely surrealist, although she didn't really define herself as a surrealist. And I wonder if that's partly because Breton had such control over who was considered a surrealist and who wasn't. Leonora Carrington was brought up by a wealthy English family, and then she became the lover of Max Ernst. So a lot of the surrealists, women who we know of, have some kind of association with the surrealist men of the original group. So there's this book, The Militant Muse, by Whitney Chadwick, which speaks about the surrealist women, and it's got a list of them. I mean, obviously there were more, but finding their information and bringing them into the canon is difficult now. But the ones that she mentions, a lot of them have some kind of link to a male surrealist. So perhaps that's why their work has retained some kind of visibility. Clearly, Leonora Carrington's success is because of the quality of her work. But I think also having connections to the original surrealists has allowed them to retain some visibility. So I'll try not to dwell on Carrington's biography, although her work is highly biographical. She, as I said, at the outbreak of World War II, she went to Spain, and in The Hearing Trumpet, which I'll speak about in a separate recording, she references Hitler, saying that he has a power complex, and she also creates a painting about a Nazi doctor. I'm not sure if I have that here. She had a great friendship with Remedios Varo, who was another Mexican painter, who again creates this type of surrealism that's not based on juxtapositions between ordinary objects taken out of context, but is more presenting almost like fables and myths, almost like stories. And you see this also in Carrington's work. Lots of references to the tales of her childhood. So Varo was one of the founders of the women's liberation movement in Mexico, and Carrington also was involved with this. They were interested in the Kabbalah and alchemy and the Popol Vuh, which is an early I can't remember if it must be by the Aztecs, and it had sort of iconography on it. So they were interested in this early Mexican iconography, and they were also interested in Mexican culture and food, and you'll see some of those references in the Hearing Trumpet. So this is another painting by Varo, and as you can see, we have this strange world, almost like something from a fairy tale, where we have this person spinning a wheel. So it has these references to the fairy tales that we're kind of familiar with, but it's also presented in a very strange way. We have this sort of strange castle that she's enclosed in, but we also have the woman wrapped up in the carpet, sort of melting into the carpet. So this is very different from the absurd surrealism that we've looked at in some of the other works that we've covered. It doesn't have the same, the same humour of putting two weird objects together for no real reason. Here we have the sense that there's a story and a narrative. And again, this is one of Leonora Carrington's works, The Giantess. Again, we can see that this is based on the idea of imaginative stories. And so a lot of her early paintings satirized English heritage, but yet she also is really influenced by the tales and narratives that she would have been read while she was a child. So we have a pictorial vocabulary of animals in her paintings. We've got a lot of this distortions of size. So here we have this idea of the fairy tale. We've got a giant from a fairy tale. And she also had a lot of recurring motifs, like the horse, the hyena, which appears in one of her stories about being a debutante and going out into society, where she was supposed to be presented for a husband. And she sends a hyena in her place. She writes a story about that. And you also find these motifs in her art. And we find also hybrid figures, much like Wilfredo Lamb. We find these half human, half animal, or combinations of various fantastic beasts that range from frightening beasts to quite humorous ones. So there's a link here between the visual syntax of her visual art and the recurring motifs that we find in her stories. And that would also be a nice comparison for an essay. In the story The House of Fear, a horse is her alter ego, and we see horses in her art as well. In fact, she presented Max Ernst as a birdman. She has symbols of alchemy, and she wasn't interested in Freud and dreams as much, more interested in these Mexican traditions and iconographies. So she blends magical realism from tales with biographical details from her own life. And we see influences like Celtic literature, which she would have been read as a child, or read, Renaissance painting, Central American folk art, medieval alchemy, and Jungian psychology. And she also touches on ideas of sexual identity, but she doesn't present, for example, nudes or objectified women. So she avoids the frequent stereotyping of women, the objectification of women that we've seen, for example, in the work of Salvador Dali and some of the other, which you'll go on to see when you read Breton's novel about Nadia. You'll see these characters presented as objects of male desire, and we saw that in the film Un Chat Andalou. Leonora Carrington manages to avoid all of this, and she represents the bonds between women of all ages. Now, I'm going to stop the recording here, and the next recording will be about the hearing trumpet, Leonora Carrington's novel.